really excited to have this opportunity to share a little bit about my book with all of you. This is, for me, a really big passion project. When I looked back on the journey that's brought me here, I realized that this is what I've been wanting to write since the very beginning of my entrepreneurial career. And this is something that I've been working towards. And I looked back 5 years ago. I had a book title called, it was Out of the Office and Into the Woods. And it was all about engaging workers in a new way. And I realized that a lot of the outline I constructed back then sort of ended up in this. And so it's really cool when you look back at something and you realize that it's had such a long journey and it's morphed in so many different ways, and now it's something that's really coming to life. So I'm really, really excited to share a little bit about it with all of you. So let me start by sharing a tale of two millennials. Now picture one millennial, millennial number one. They're on their way from college, they're graduating, and they've got a couple job offers, they've got some traditional job offers, and then they've got like kind of a different type of job offer. And they say, nah, I don't want those traditional job offers because, you know, I don't like the clothes they make me wear, I don't like the job environment. All right, I'm gonna take the kind of non-traditional one. So they take the non-traditional job offer, they start working. Immediately when they start working, they're like, no, I want more challenging projects. I want to be working on the top stuff at this company. You guys are boring me. Don't make me do all these routine tasks. And then they're like, you know what? I really don't like this location. It's not working out for me personally. I want to move to another location. So they move to another location. And then at some point, they're just like, you know, I want to leave this company and start my own venture. And they end up living with parents and friends along the way. Okay, millennial number one. Now let's picture millennial number two. Okay, millennial number two graduates with honors, had several internships with really challenging experiences, started a company, and they were managing 5 projects when the norm was 2. They constantly looked at understanding their personal strengths and figuring out, well, which of those personal strengths is really going to contribute to the company. And as they did that, they found that they were looking at new experiences and started transitioning throughout the company to places that matched their strengths better. And eventually, they also left the company to start their own venture. But after carefully mitigating some risks and financially making some sound decisions around saving. So, which of these two millennials do you think is more lazy and entitled? Which of them would you say is more millennial? Funny part. These are both me. This is really the story of one millennial, one Crystal Kadakia. It just depends on the lens you're using to look at my story and to look at my behavior. So, if you look at the whole picture, I graduated from UT Austin, chemical engineering degree, graduated with honors, graduated with some great experiences working for NASA, working for professors, and also working for P&G, which ended up being the job offer I took out of college. Now, I chose P&G because traditional chemical engineers, you have to wear fire-retardant clothing, you have to climb up distillation columns. That was not me. I was not the hand job, manicure salon girl either, but I was definitely not the fire-retardant clothing type of person. So I joined P&G. I started out as a project engineer, constantly was asking for more projects, ended up with 5 projects when the norm was 2. I kept on working on stuff outside of my direct role. I kept on working on people-related activities and slowly started realizing, looking at my strengths and my passions, that where I was really making an impact was in this human capital realm. And so I actually transitioned and became a training manager at P&G, training engineers. So I became that bridge. The time that I became a bridge, I also had a direct report who was a boomer. And we would talk a lot about millennials because we were creating programs, new hire programs, and the media was talking a lot about millennials. And everything we saw in the new hire programs didn't line up with what the media was saying. So I started feeling like, hey, there's something that I could be saying or contributing to training as a field that's a little bit different than what I'm seeing out there for training when it comes to generations. So I started speaking outside of work, and eventually this led to me launching Embody Consulting. So about 4 years ago, I started my company on the side, and then it eventually became a full-time venture. So since then, I've spoken at 2 TEDx events, spoken at 100+ events at this point, multiple awards. We talked a little bit about Generation University, our award-winning training program. I also co-facilitate a program on modern learning, and so on and so forth. And I mentioned pursuing a master's degree. So this is all a story of one millennial. And it really depends on which lens you're using when you interpret my behavior. Am I the lazy and entitled millennial, or am I a driven, overachieving millennial? And most people who meet me, they'll tell you that she's one of the most driven people I've met, she's very overachieving. And you would rarely think of me as that lazy and entitled person. But if I gave you just those slivers, you might think that. So when you look at Embody Consulting and what my business is and what my passion is, what are the problems I saw with this whole discussion around generations? Well, the first problem is the pervasive stereotypes. And these stereotypes are so pervasive, leaders are saying it, it's just sunk in. And it's sunk in for some specific reasons. But let's imagine a VP at a Fortune 500 company. And this VP, their mantra is the way we've always done things. Here's some of the statements you hear, and just after speaking so many places, this is what I often hear. Millennials are just a trend. They're not really that different. When they grow up, they'll want money. They're going to be motivated by the paycheck, just like everyone else, when they really grow up. I mean, right now it's fine. They're single, they're in their 20s, whatever, they're delaying marriage. But when they really grow up, these millennials are lazy and entitled. What can anybody, it's not just me that has this problem, what can anyone do to engage and attract them? Now, when you think about a VP who has these kinds of beliefs, how do you think that might influence their ability to build an effective workplace culture? Consider another VP who's all about legacy, authenticity, being a visionary. Here's some of the things you might hear them say. We live in a changing world. I want to stay fresh. I want to stay connected to this younger generation. I want to know what's coming down the line. I don't want to be blindsided. In our generation, hey, there was a diversity of personality and style too. There was people I would have called lazy back then. When I was starting my career, there's people I would have thought of as really ambitious, and maybe even overly ambitious. And at the end of the day, this isn't really just about millennials. There's something going on. We have a disengaged workforce. There's been a lot of rapid change, and there's something beyond generations that needs to be addressed. Now, if you imagine a VP with these types of beliefs, how do you think that might impact their decision-making and culture building? It's a little bit different. Well, unfortunately, the majority of people that I've spoken to and researched with belong in this category of the way we've always done things. And one big reason for that is because it's reinforced by a high volume of negative media. And one of the things I always hear is, hey, generations have been going in and out of the workplace for generations. Every generation has complained about the next generation. It's all gravy. It's going to go away. No big deal. Well, the difference is that we have so much more media today. I mean, it's not just newspapers and magazines and your neighbors. It's social media. And we always talk about information overload and what a big problem that is. Well, when it comes to biases, it creates a virality. It creates an even bigger problem. And that's sort of what's happened. I mean, think about how many blogs and articles and rants and so on and so forth that you see about millennials, right? I mean, this guy, Dan Rants About Millennials, Get Off My Lawn, he created a 10-minute long video about how much he hates millennials. And millennials don't really help their case either. They're creating fun little videos that just kind of reinforce some of these same negative stereotypes because this is what gets attention. So it's to the point where the word millennials is Googled about 250,000 times a month. I don't think this happened for boomers, right? And the last time I searched lazy and entitled, came up with 15.8 million results on Google. I just went through the first 25 pages and they were all about millennials. I gave up after that. So, as unbiased as we would like to be, no matter what, when you receive this volume of information in terms of negative stereotypes, it starts to sink in. And something I often tell my VPs that I talk to is, if you said this about any other group, it would be discrimination, right? If I said that all women are lazy and entitled, no woman here would be happy, to put it lightly. But there's a deeper problem here. It's not just that there's this pervasive stereotype. It's that there's an unspoken fear hiding behind these stereotypes. And it's that we have an outdated corporate workplace model. Now, how did this happen? Digital changed society rapidly. Almost so rapidly that this 9-to-5 workplace model quickly got outdated. And we're still trying to catch up to this. Millennials are kind of our scapegoat. They're that first generation to grow up with the internet and the last generation to remember a world without it. So what I talk about a lot in the book is how millennials are just a reflection of how much digital has changed society. And so it's sort of like everything we don't like about how digital has changed society, we use millennials as our scapegoat. Like, oh, millennials have an attention span less than goldfish. If you actually look at the neuroscience, that's humans now because of the internet. But we always say, well, millennials, you can only capture their attention for 5 seconds. And goldfish, they have 7-second attention span. Right? And it's like, well, it's not really just millennials, but they've become our scapegoat. And so how it shows up in the workplace is that companies are struggling to attract, retain, and engage digitally enabled talent, even if it's not millennials. And so a lot of times in the book, I'll say it's not just millennial, it's modern. It's not just millennial, it's about digitally enabled talent. So the majority of folks, the way we've always done things, minority looking at that. And what is that gap there? It comes from a fear of change, a fear of being left behind because of the rapid changes that have happened with digital, fear of being wrong, and then those biases, those negative stereotypes, and feeling the safety in numbers. Well, everyone's complaining about millennials, so we must be okay in our old ways of thinking. And frankly, a lot of leaders they're at the end of their careers, and they're too tired to decipher these latest trends or to drive change. They're just trying to make it to, I just don't want my company to go under before I retire, and then I'm good. So the Millennial Myth is written to really talk about and address these two problems. So the solution, as I position it, is really about how studying millennials and their behavior holds clues for how we should and should not work in the future. So it's looking at specific organizational culture trends that have emerged from studying this millennial behavior. And so how do I do that? In the book, I really focus on two main things. The first is to reestablish the lens with which leaders and managers view millennials for 5 of the most commonly misunderstood millennial behaviors. And then the second is to link that new understanding to specific organizational strategies. And that's really to help enable corporations to start catching up. And to be really clear, a lot of tech companies or certain industries may not need this as much as other industries. We all know about kind of the dinosaur industries, or the ones we're worried about not existing in the future. This is part of why we're worried about them not existing. So how do I go about doing this? In terms of reestablishing the lens, one of the things that I use as a tool in my book is something I call the one coin, two sides model. And the idea is that just as every coin has 2 sides, every millennial behavior can be interpreted in many ways. So, just as if you're looking at my story, you could look at it with one filter and get certain things out of that story. You could look at it from another lens, or you could look at it from a more balanced picture overall. So what I try to do throughout the book is really look at every millennial behavior as having multiple sides, multiple ways of interpretation, and giving people an opportunity to balance out their perspective for each of those behaviors. And we do this for 5 behaviors. So we take folks from lazy to talking about redefining productivity, from entitled to entrepreneurial, from needing to be handheld to agile, from disloyal to purpose-driven, and from authority issues to respect redefined. So for 5 of the most commonly misunderstood behaviors, we look at kind of how did we arrive at either ends perspective of the coin. And it's all about really developing that different lens. So let's take a look at one of these, from lazy to productivity redefined. And this one I always like to start with because it's a fairly easy one to grasp. If I look at the journey from the traditional mindset, which sort of leads to the stereotype of lazy, and the modern mindset, what might that look like? And for this one, when I look at the 1.2 size model, I'm really focusing on one specific observable behavior. And the observable behavior here is that millennials often desire flexible work arrangements or flexible work hours and environment. So when I started looking at this, and I looked at the journey from traditional modern, I started thinking, well, where did we get the concept of 9 to 5? And as I started doing my research in this area, I didn't realize that this is actually not that established of a concept. Like, it's fairly new in society. We actually fought hundreds of years to get to 9 to 5, to an 8-hour workday. And there was a time where we worked in in farms, and we shifted to being in a manufacturing environment, and unions formed, and the labor market and the labor conditions were so bad that they were like, we really need an 8-hour workday. And so what happened is, in Henry Ford's time, he was one of the pioneers of the 8-hour workday. And he was looking at setting up work as a manufacturing line, as an assembly line. And that's really where the idea of 9 to 5 came from, where you could predictably look at productivity and time and connect the two very clearly. The time you put in relates to the units that you produce. Well, when you start looking at this, you start thinking, well, how has the work world changed since assembly line days? And there's some fascinating research out there about this. So Deloitte did a study on where we get our corporate value creation in the US. And in 1982, 60% of it was from tangible assets, things like manufacturing plants and so on. Well, by 2010, it totally flipped. 85% of our corporate value is now created from intangible assets, which is folks like you and me, the work we do up here, the work we do with one another. Another interesting data point, the change in the kinds of work we do. So think about job automation and the growth of non-routine manual and non-routine cognitive jobs, and how that's changed just from 2001. So all of our kind of predictable rote work is on a decline by -8, -10%, and our strategic, highly cognitive work, whether it's manual or in front of a computer, is going up. So the type of work we're doing has changed. And so from a modern mindset, the question becomes, does the assembly line setup still create productivity? And it's just a question, right? It's like, let's look at the kind of work we do and think about what conditions create productivity for that. And millennials grew up in this world where you can learn anywhere, work from anywhere, anytime. So now what seems so simple is calling someone lazy because they're looking at the clock and leaving at 5 o'clock, or wanting to work until 3 and pick that back up again at 6 or later in the evening. What very easily seems like, oh, that's someone who's lazy and doesn't want to put the hours in, maybe has a little bit of a different definition of what productivity is. Somebody who's probably experimented with personal productivity since they were, teenagers, looking at their computers and studying in school. So it just starts to change. So when you look at the workplace strategy, time-based performance, just because that's how we've always done things, does that really make sense? Maybe we need to look at it per job. Maybe there's certain jobs where time-based performance makes sense and some where it doesn't. Open office environments just because Google does it. So it's really, does that make sense? If you look at the type of work you're doing, what is really enabling productivity? And a lot of times, companies will want to just copy and paste Google and find that it doesn't work in their own environments. So it starts really questioning and looking at your flexible work policies, environments that are enabling productivity, and we go a lot more in detail into what that looks like and sounds like in the book. And throughout it, we give examples as well. So, for example, the governor of Utah, he actually created a 4-day work week during the recession to save money. It was like, oh, we get to shut down all the buildings for an extra day. But what they found was actually engagement went up, productivity went up, customers liked it better because now they had extended hours on those 4 days. And so there was actually a really big benefit to looking at the kind of work that they were doing and, hey, is this something we could do, move to a 4-day work week? And they actually found a lot of benefits. So another example, from authority issues to respect what you find. Authority issues, what this is really talking about is how millennials have a different perception of hierarchy. So a lot of times I'll hear leaders talk about this as not having a respect for decorum. And, you know, knocking on a director's door, just saying hi, walking in, don't have a meeting, no big deal, and thinking that that's okay. So again, when you look at this journey, you start off in this command and control mindset, in a traditional mindset, and boomers rocked this mindset. They came and they were like, you know, if you asked me to jump how high, I don't think so. But millennials really took it further and further. When you think about what's changed, how diversity has changed, right? Affirmative action, the gender wage gap, and things that were going on in the 80s with that. You think about how TV has changed the insights we have into trusted leaders and what they're doing behind closed doors. And that just kind of continued as millennials were growing up, and they would see that online. So the idea of just respecting someone because they've attained a certain position or had a certain tenure is a little bit more complicated. It comes up for question. Is that the only way that I judge somebody? And then you throw the lens of the internet on top of that, where anyone can gain a following, and you don't really get to see who the person is. So I had a friend who, in high school, he really liked WWF, and so he started writing articles online. He actually hijacked or created his own email address for a professional news website, and he just assigned himself an email that sounded like the professional guy, and he started posting up articles on their website. Started getting $1,000 a month from this at 14, and they didn't know that it was a 14-year-old kid who had just assigned himself one of their email addresses who was getting this kind of attention. And a few months later, they found out and they cut it off. But you just think about the internet, and you could be anyone. Those macro characteristics don't matter as much. And so the workplace strategies related to this, it's the idea that doing everything behind closed doors, hiding your vulnerability as a leader. Maybe it doesn't work in this world of transparency. Isolating groups based on macro diversity characteristics. So in other words, gender, ethnicity, so on. Those are things that millennials have grown up knowing exist, and they're really focused more on the micro differences. Because again, on the internet, you have this anonymity, and it's really about your pure contribution. And so this brings to life things like social CEOs and a concept that I call coversity. And coversity is all about, instead of having something like a women's network, where, you know, if you're a woman, you know this, they say the biggest problem with women's in the workplace is that men aren't involved in the conversation. And that's because you have something called a women's network, where it's almost like a keep boys out, you know, no boys allowed type of thing. And it's, what if we had a gender network? And within that, you can have subgroups, but then you're also able to talk about gender differences together at that level, and gender style, and so on and so forth. And so we talk a little bit about that and examples of that in the book as well. So there's a lot of features, tools, and resources in this. There's the 1.2 sides model, the tales from the trenches, so a lot of these workplace examples, and a lot of the workplace examples are also experimental. This is all very much in the forefront. These are companies who are experimenting with how do we incorporate these millennial behaviors and learn from them into what a modern workplace looks like. There's stories of relationships that work, so from an individual level and not as much on an organizational level. At the end of every chapter, we include several tools, one being a self-assessment where you can really do a gut check for how modern is your organization. And then a 10-minute champion, which is a list of ideas that someone could champion in 10 minutes or less to move their organization forward in some of these modern workplace areas. And then there's an online tool bank as well with a lot of, it's a fairly brief, it's going to have chapter summaries as well as places where folks can collaborate online. So places where you can collect key insights, where you can add your own 10-minute champion ideas, and so on and so forth. And I want to end this by talking about a story. You know, I said earlier that it's not just about millennials, it's modern. And the reason why I say that is because digital is not going away. The impact of digital on folks who are growing up is not going away. And so for me, the millennial myth is something that starts with millennials, but your best chance of getting it right is with millennials, because we're that last generation that's going to remember growing up without the internet. And so to highlight that, just want to share a story of a time that I was on an airplane. And I was sitting next to a father and his 4-year-old daughter. And he had handed her the airline magazine. And so she was doing this to the cover. She couldn't figure out how to turn the page. Like, she literally was just used to using a tablet. And he saw me looking over and he said, "Oh, it gets worse. When I say things that she doesn't like, she does this." Tries to swipe. Now can you imagine those behaviors at work? You know, and I'm sure that from the time that she's 4 to the time that she turns 22, she's going to pick up some other skills on the way. But digital is influencing all of us in ways we can't imagine. And millennials are a pivotal generation because they're the last to remember that world without the internet. Another story I often like to share is when I was talking to a 15-year-old, he had never heard the sound of a dial-up modem. And so I actually pulled it up on YouTube, and we were listening to it, and he was like, "Okay." And then he's like, "Wait, this is what you had to listen to connect to the internet?" "Yeah." "You had to wait?" Life was hard. So you just think about it, and that's like, you know, maybe 10 to 15 years younger than me. Not that much younger than me when you think about it, but the changes of the internet and how quickly that's sunk in. It's fast. So we might have had generations before to adapt to these kinds of changes, but right now this is a rapid time. Digital is a really big shift, and corporate's really kind of lagging and catching up with these kinds of things. So I also love this quote: "One of the best feelings in the world is knowing your presence and absence both mean something to someone." When it comes to attracting, retaining, and engaging modern talent, does the presence and the absence of your company mean something to your employees? And what does that look like in a modern workplace? So this is all about kind of putting a different lens on to think of it more as this versus the complaining. So that's what I call the Great Contradiction. I hear of all these leaders who are saying, you know, millennials are lazy and entitled. They're so hard to work with. I can't get them to show up on time, so on and so forth. And on the other hand, they're like, I want to engage and attract these folks. That's the Great Contradiction. How can you be complaining and saying that you want to build a magnetic culture? You got to resolve that contradiction before you can really make an impact. And that's what we do with the Millennial Myth. Really dispel the myths, but also start framing it with replacement language, replacement ideas of how to think about those same behaviors, and then really connect that to organizational culture changes. So it's all about the power of having the right language or a less biased language, and then knowing what to do with it. And that's really what we're focused on in the book. So that's about it. Thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to share a little bit about the book and give you a sneak preview. Happy to answer any questions and just hear your thoughts.
We changed Crystal's price like yesterday afternoon, and she's already changed it on her PowerPoint slide.
I'm such a millennial. Look at that. Fast changing stuff.
Man, this digital thing really isn't helpful.
I have to change it to approximately 200 pages, so I wasn't sure what the exact page count's going to be, which we were just talking about this morning as well. Yeah, question.
So I was curious how your clients react to the content you share with them and what policy changes that inspires them to make, and if you have to coach them through any emotional barriers to get them there.
Wow, that's a loaded question, so thank you. No, you know, what's great is that so many, especially at the leadership level, honestly, people are really tired of hearing the word millennial and hearing the rants. honestly, in terms of the content, they're usually very happy to hear something that's more practical versus the rant side of it. Now, in terms of implementing the cultural changes, that's where we're really, just even as a business, for me, I'm really on the leading edge of that. Because folks are just getting to the point where there's enough awareness of it's not just the rant, but hey, there's something meaningful we need to do here. And so they're just getting to that point where they believe that. And once they believe that, it's starting to put the investment dollars against it. So for me, the consulting side of my practice is just launching. Because in the last 2-3 years, it's been all about the speaking and growing awareness. So that way we can get to the point where it's like, yes, there's a reason to invest into making some of these changes versus just thinking, well, this is a generational thing, it's a fad, the millennials will adopt the rest of the practices that have been going on for how we've always done things, and then Gen Z is going to come along, they're going to be totally different. One of the questions I always used to get is, well, if we do this for millennials, aren't we just going to have to redo it all when Gen Z comes? And that's because they're thinking of it as a generational thing versus a step change, digital-enabled workforce thing. So we're just at the leading edge of that, not a complete, we've got to see how that keeps on panning out. Because there certainly are a lot of challenges with starting to take maybe an organization that's worked one way for the last decades and think of transforming it to a new place. So a lot of it starts with piloting it in small groups and then building momentum from there. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say your book is fantastic and it's so meaty. There's so much content, and your presentation was spectacular too.
Thank you.
Great speaker. So I hire a lot of millennials, and I love working with them because it's the first time I've ever hired people where they know more than me, and they're still really inexpensive to hire. And they figure everything out. They'll watch a video. If I don't know how to do something, they'll watch a video and figure it out. And anything I want. And do you talk about that? Like, don't employers see the tremendous advantage of having someone come in that knows how to do all the, I've had my, 22-year-olds do consulting calls with my clients about social media because they know more than I do. And I've been transparent about it. And they're like, yeah, we want to talk to the millennials. So do you put that out in the book, just like what an advantage it is from that standpoint?
I would like to think I've talked about the advantages throughout the book. I think one of the comments was that it can even almost come off as too Pollyanna-ish of, well, they can do all of this and more. But part of it is it's really true. But I think that it's also just a recognition that we all have our different skills to bring. So I wish that more employers were like you, first of all, because that would make things with the conversations a lot easier. But I also think that millennials often have a hard time understanding the value of experience in situational leadership. And so it's sort of are both sides seeing the value that they both bring and coming together and working from that point. But yeah, I think I see some clients who really get it, and I see some that just, it's a fear of being wrong or a fear of change or a fear of I've been here this whole time and now you can do all these things instantly. Is my job threatened because of that? Especially at larger corporations, there can be a lot more of that type of fear. And so, I think it definitely depends on size of company, it definitely depends on the industry, how strong that fear is versus the potential benefits. Nate? Yeah.
So I have a question. I really like the concept of the book because, and one of the things I'm curious about is, millennials are not a monolith by any means, and workplace culture is different depending on who's there. Do you have sort of strategies for engaging different people who are either in different parts of their career or like specifically like someone who's under-engaged versus someone who is not going to be engaged no matter what you do?
Yeah,
How do you have that conversation?
I love that you bring this up because I think that's another big complaint millennials often have is that you're putting us all in this one bucket.
Right.
And I think that something that's cool about the way that this is all written is it's really based on, it's very principle-based versus typecasting based. Like all millennials want this. It's more of asking the question of, well, what might productivity look like for different people in different environments and different work styles? So I think just the approach of it being more of a question versus a here is the answer, lends itself to being a more, how do you personalize your strategies, and how do you customize it? Because I think another important part to recognize is that in modern times, we are all used to being able to have a lot of choices and being able to pick and choose what works for me. And that's whether you're a boomer or a millennial or a woman or an Asian or whatever, you're going to pick what works for you because that's what you're used to outside of your company, is being able to pick exactly what you want. And so that in itself is a cultural change. How do you get from a one-size-fits-all approach to a customizable, people can choose what's in it for them approach? And that's definitely, I would say that's throughout the book as sort of a fundamental theme, is in each of these 5 areas, it really is about questioning and opening it up to how do you individualize versus one-size-fits-all, put people in buckets. So, yeah. You have to read it and let me know how true to that it is. I'll go here and then here, and I'll see how much time we have.
Yeah, we still have about 5 minutes.
Okay, good. I can answer 2 questions in 5 minutes.
So I really like your approach, actually, and I kind of, my question almost goes like a little bit to the side of it. And what I like about your approach is that you stay away from like the ranting and the stereotyping and all of the media stuff. But one thing that, this is more a question for you because you've done a lot of this work intergenerationally that I've always wondered myself when reading all this media is, have you ever, like, do you have any thoughts on the fact that many of the same people that in the workplace are complaining about millennials are the people that have raised a millennial themselves? Like, it's cognitive dissonance. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and some of it is I wonder how much of their relationship with their kids are they projecting? And it's like, wow, that, like, you just should not cross that line, because as a parent, you might get frustrated, but no reason to do it at work, right? No, what's interesting is that I think this whole time of millennials entering the workplace is almost like a coming of age for a lot of those parents, just as much as it is for their kids, because when they were raising their kids, and I'm kind of saying they, and I know there's a lot of people in this room I might be saying they for, but when you're raising your kids, you may have had a certain approach, and now you see what happened to them as adults. And this is especially when I talk to helicopter parents. They're like, yeah, my kids changed majors 6 times, and I don't know if I should just cut them off or what I should do. And they're seeing the consequences of whatever they did before show up as adults. So a lot of times, I always just ask this question back to them of, well, given everything you've learned, what would you do differently in this work environment with these folks? Because they're not your kids. Like, there are adults. They're adults who've been hired by your company and have made it through your interview process. So, you want to treat that differently than you would with your kids. So a lot of it is just helping them see that distinction and mature from, you might have had a parenting style, but a parenting style is not the same as a coworker style or a manager style. Because if you don't, and that, man, that's such an important distinction. I think there's so many managers who have kids who are thinking of the job of being a manager as being a parent. And no. just don't cross that line. So.
Quick question.
Quick question, last question.
Yeah, I've raised 2 millennials, 27 and 30-year-old, and they both tell me they don't identify as millennials if it's a negative stereotype. So I told them about this book, and they both love it because I think it really helps a lot of folks that says, well, there's a whole other way to look at it, so that they will say at some point in the future, yes, I'm a proud millennial, versus, what they say now is that, yes, I am by age, but not by what I hear. But the question I wanted to ask is, you said at the beginning that you're getting your master's in organizational development at Pepperdine. I just wondered what of what you're learning at Pepperdine is finding its way into this book?
Oh, Gary, that's a great question. Well, actually, speaking of, the whole concept of group dynamics is what we're really focused on right now. And that's been coming up a lot as I start thinking about how partners, how executive teams work, and how the norms of an executive team may dictate how they view their their talent coming in. So if the norm in that group, if the bias in that group is the way we've always done things, then the one person who speaks out about, well, maybe we should think about this differently, they have a lot more resistance to encounter in adopting a different lens versus groups where maybe they're a little bit more open. So I think there's a lot to be said for when you talk about implementing some of these cultural changes. One person can read this book. Does it change their mind? Kind of need the entire team to read it and then to do more with it, right? And to build that momentum. And a lot of it may be changing some of the group biases, the group norms, some of the group fears that stop them from opening up and thinking about it differently. Because for this to really change, folks, it really has to start from leaders, managers, and so on.
I think with that,
Good.
Thank you.